I was 25 and decided to take a trip into the city after my mom's passing. She died unexpectedly, and I still lived with her at the time. I needed to get out of the house. Everything inside of it reminded me of her. I chose a hotel that had relatively good reviews, and the price for the room was too good to pass up. I won't reveal the hotel's name for obvious reasons, and the main one being that I'm just trying to forget the experience altogether, and even typing out its name is hard for me. The hotel had an old-world charm that instantly drew me in. As I checked in, I couldn't help but admire how clean everything was. It was the kind of place that you see in postcards, and I was looking forward to getting to my room and finally being able to relax after everything I'd been through that month. My room was on the second floor, and it was nice to see that it had a view of the garden. The hotel staff was friendly, and everything seemed perfect. It started innocently enough on the first night. I went down to the hotel's restaurant for dinner. As I sat alone at the corner table, I noticed a man at the bar. He was tall with messy hair and a pretty scruffy beard. He seemed to be in his 40s and was wearing a faded leather jacket and jeans. I don't know why I remember what he was wearing, but I do. I caught his eye for a moment, and he gave me a nod. I'm a pretty awkward person, so I just looked away and pretended like he didn't just catch me staring. The night went on, and I tried not to think about it too much. After dinner, I returned to my room and settled in for the night. I watched some TV, read a book, and eventually fell asleep. But when I woke up the next morning, things just felt a little off. As I stepped out of my room and made my way down the hall towards the elevator, I noticed the same man from the night before. He was leaning against the wall just a few feet from my room, and his eyes were locked onto me. It sent a shiver down my spine, and it was not the good kind. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that I was getting, thinking that it might just be a coincidence, but that voice in my head was telling me something was wrong. I should have listened to it. I decided to try and go about my day without being too paranoid, but being a woman all by myself, a small bit of paranoia is required. I wanted to see the sights and explore the city, but no matter where I went, I had this eerie feeling that someone was following me, and I couldn't escape the feeling of just being watched. That night I got back to the hotel and decided to have dinner in that restaurant again. I really didn't want to run into that dude again, but the convenience of eating and being able to go straight up to your room was just too tempting to pass up. I also hoped that being around people would ease my nerves. As I sat at my table, the same man walked in once again, sat at the bar. Only this time he was closer, and he was facing me. He had a drink in hand, staring very intently at me. I tried not to look at him, but when someone is staring at you and won't even stop when you look back at them, you can't help but take a peek every so often to see if they continue. After a short while, his face changed into sort of a smile, and I was just thoroughly creeped out. I got up to leave and noticed that he got up at the same time. He began walking out after me and was eerily close behind me as he did so. I swear I could feel him breathing on the back of my neck as we walked. I tried asking him nicely to just stay further back, but he started to laugh. He followed me all the way up to my floor and stopped a few doors down from my room. I entered my room quickly, glancing back at him, and noticed that he was doing the same thing as before, just standing there in the hall, clearly waiting for me, or waiting to do something to me, all without saying a word. I knew I probably shouldn't ignore it anymore. I was scared and confused. So, I decided to approach the hotel staff about the situation first, before I went so far as to just call the police. The man hadn't actually done anything to physically harm me, so I doubt that there was anything that they would have been able to do anyways. I explained my discomfort and the fact that I had seen the man loitering near my room multiple times, and they were actually understanding and assured me that they would keep an eye on things. For the next couple of days I stayed close to the hotel and inside my room for the most part. I even considered cutting my trip short, but I didn't want to let fear dictate my choices. This was supposed to be my time to heal, and I didn't want to let some freak of a man ruin it. As a person traveling alone, as I was determined to just reclaim my sense of security. Unfortunately, every day I was there, I saw that guy. Sometimes he would be in the lobby, other times in the hallway or near my room, and occasionally he would be at the restaurant. He even managed to come into the gym the few times that I randomly decided to work out. It was as if he was playing a twisted game of cat and mouse with me. I became increasingly paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when and where he'd appear next. One night after I'd been there for about a week, I returned to my room after dinner, and I was shocked to find a note had been slipped under my door. The handwriting almost looked like it was hurried and barely legible, and all it said was, "Watching you." My heart raced as I read the note over and over again. I had to know that it was from him. I immediately called the front desk and reported the note. The staff told me that they were taking the situation very seriously and advised me to just lock my door, stay in the room, and wait for them to check the security tapes. They assured me that they'd find the man to get the police involved if necessary. I sat in my room waiting anxiously for someone to tell me that the man was being kicked out, or even that he was being arrested, and that I'd be okay. Minutes turned into hours, and the sense of dread only intensified. What if the staff couldn't find the guy? What if he was waiting for me somewhere in the hotel? What if he was in my room, and I just didn't know it? It almost felt like I was being hunted. Finally, a knock at my door broke the silence. It was the hotel manager along with the security guard. They informed me that they had found the man who was in the process of being escorted off the premises. They assured me that he wouldn't be allowed back in the hotel, and that they were involving the police to be sure all necessary steps were being taken to resolve the issue. I was relieved but still shaken. I thanked the hotel staff for their quick response and for believing me when I told them something was wrong. I was later contacted by a detective who informed me that the man was arrested after they found multiple pictures of me in his coat pocket. As it turned out, the man had been stalking me for almost a year without me ever knowing. His apartment was filled with pictures of me in the town that I lived in, doing everyday things. There were even pictures of me at my mom's funeral, pictures of me in my house taken through my windows. I have no idea how I never noticed that someone was constantly following me, but I guess realizing when I did, before he tried anything physical, was better than realizing too late. He was charged with aggravated stalking, and looking back, this experience taught me the importance of trusting my instincts and taking action when I feel unsafe. I remember it being a kind of cold night in October. The day had been long, and I was exhausted from a work trip that had me driving for hours. Now, for context, I was a somewhat smaller man and always considered myself a sort of pessimist. I decided to pull over at what looked to be just a run-of-the-mill hotel right off the freeway. It was one of those places that people on road trips could stay without having to drive into a big city to get a few hours of sleep. The hotel looked like it had seen better days. The sign outside read, "Vacant," and I didn't have to wonder why. The parking lot was practically empty, save for a few rusted-up beaters. I parked my own car and made my way to the lobby. Inside, I was greeted by a sort of disinterested clerk who was too busy paying attention to his phone to even look up at me. I paid for a room and was handed a key, barely receiving a word during the whole interaction. It was kind of weird. As I made my way to the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really off about this place, but I was too exhausted to care. Though my room was no better than the rest of the place, the curtains were torn and stained in multiple places, and the air smelled like mildew. I decided to take a quick shower and just practically collapsed on the bed. My plan was to catch a few hours of sleep, wake up, and get out of there before sunrise. I must have slept for no more than an hour when I was jolted awake by a loud argument coming from the room next door. It sounded like a couple of people arguing over something I couldn't quite make out. I got out of bed and pressed my ear against the really thin wall that separated our rooms. I could hear the muffled, "Where's my money, Derek?" There was a very gruff voice demanding this, and I remember specifically someone saying back, "I swear, Joey, I'll get it to you by tomorrow." The other guy, who I'm guessing was probably that Derek person, sounded incredibly scared. It was kind of surreal in the moment, and I could hear the conversation escalating. It became clear that someone was going to get hurt. I knew I had to do something, but fear pretty much had me frozen. I contemplated calling the police, but I didn't have any concrete information to provide them, and not to get political either. but I also know police can also just make situations worse. And just as I was considering my options, the argument turned violent. I heard a loud crash echoing through the walls, followed by what I can only assume were punches being thrown. Again, the walls were almost paper thin, and I could hear everything. Am I completely sure I heard punches? No, but one can assume considering that they were both just yelling at each other. Derek clearly didn't have the upper hand. I exited my room and sort of just tiptoed to the door, peeking through the peephole into the neighboring room. The hotel was old and obviously didn't bother changing to a one-way peephole. What I saw at that moment gave me chills. Derek was being held down by two men, both much larger and a lot scarier than he was. He was bruised, and there was blood dripping from his nose and out of his mouth. His eyes were swollen shut, and tears were running down his face. As I could now hear him begging for his life. The men had their backs to the door, and I knew that I had no choice but at that moment to contact somebody. It would have been wrong for me to not set my own personal opinions aside when someone else's life was in danger. I went back to my room immediately, grabbed my cell phone, and dialed 911. I whispered to the dispatcher about the situation, explained my location as best I could. It was hard considering I didn't know the area at all. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crept back to that peephole, trying to keep tabs on the nightmare that was happening right next door. And just as I looked, I saw one of the men draw a gun from his waistband. Panic surged through me and I sank to the floor. I was scared and couldn't risk them seeing me or hearing me through the door. The sound of those gunshots pierced the air, and I could hear Derek's screams of agony. Tears started to well up in my eyes as I felt completely helpless, and the minutes dragged on. As I huddled on the floor just inside my room, the sound of Derek's suffering was one of the worst things I'd ever heard. He was moaning and crying out in pain. I listened as the other men made fun of him. They found him weak for showing that he was in that type of pain, and I found that incredibly disgusting, considering that they just shot him multiple times. I heard more shuffling in the room next door and was relieved to hear what sounded like the men leaving. After what felt like a small eternity, I actually heard the sirens approaching the hotel. Relief washed over me as I looked through my own peephole and saw the police arrive, followed by paramedics. The officers pounded on the door of the room next to me, demanding that whoever was inside surrender. I guess they hadn't realized the men had already left. The only response they got was Derek now pleading for them to help him. I heard them break down the door and call for paramedics. I was full of fear and anxiety as I waited for the officers to clear the scene and hopefully get this guy the help he needed. Finally, an officer knocked on my door, identifying himself. I opened the door and was eager to tell them everything that I had heard and seen. They told me that they'd have to take me down to the station to make a formal statement, and I found that odd, but I did what I had to do. I packed up my stuff from my room and headed down to the police station. And as I sat there in that police station that night, providing my statement to a detective for what seemed like the 100th time, I couldn't help but think about whether or not that Derek guy was okay. I never met him or even interacted with him once, but somehow I just felt a connection with him in those split moments. And in my eyes, no one deserves to die in such a violent way just because they probably owed someone money. I wish that there was more I could have done, but being how small I am, not trained in really anything. If I would have intervened, I probably would have been severely injured, probably even killed. And no matter how many people like to say that they would, I just couldn't risk my own life for someone I didn't even know. I was informed later that night that Derek had passed away not long after arriving at the hospital. His gunshot wounds were pretty severe, and there was nothing they could do. So, I was a manager of a hotel when what I'm about to tell you occurred. It was around 1 a.m., and no new guests had arrived for a couple of hours. It seemed like a pretty slow night. I was talking to one of the employees about how, whenever a night is this slow or quiet, something bad usually happens. They said I was just being superstitious, but I've come to realize that usually is the truth. I've seen a lot during my 10 years as a manager. Plenty of domestic disturbances, fights in the hallways, drug deals gone wrong, and the list really does go on and on. But that night had to have been the worst. At around 1:30 a.m., after my coworkers were finally finished telling me how ridiculous I was being about the quiet night, I got a call from one of the rooms. I answered and was met with the voice of a little boy. He sounded maybe like 5 at the most, and he started telling me that he wanted his mommy and that I had to get her. I asked if he was okay, and he said yes, but just that he wanted his mommy. I started to get concerned, and just as I was going to ask what room number he was in, a man came to the phone, identified himself as the boy's father, and apologized for his son wasting my time. Before I could even get a word in, the line just went dead. We were old school, so we couldn't even tell what room he had called from. I got a little worried, so I started asking around to my employees to see if any of them remembered a man checking into a room with a little boy. I was having no luck until I asked our restaurant manager, and he said a man had come in with a little boy earlier that night and had used the voucher that we gave all of our guests. Thankfully, it was only a voucher used that day, and it had the room number on it. I grabbed one of the larger men that we had on staff and had him go to the room. I had no intentions of confronting the man or even asking any questions. I just wanted to see the boy and make sure that he was okay. So I grabbed a few towels, told my employee to wait at the end of the hall, and I knocked on the door. A man answered. He was short, chubby, and smelled horribly of just alcohol. Behind him on the bed was the little boy. He was so skinny, I could see his ribs, and he looked like he was covered in bruises. I tried to act calm and told the man that I had the towels that he requested. He, of course, denied requesting towels and just shut the door in my face. I turned around and speed walked down the hall into the elevator. Once I was back at the front desk, I immediately called the police. I was instructed to act naturally and not make any further contact with the man to avoid him running with the boy. My heart was racing, and I was sweating profusely as I waited for the police. They surrounded the building and came in by the dozen. I told them what room they were in and gave them the key. They had me come up with them in case there was a problem getting access to the room. I really didn't want to go up there, but if there was any chance that they could help that boy, I was going to take it. The elevator ride seemed to last forever as I thought out every possible scenario for what was about to go down. The elevator stopped, and I and about 8 officers stepped off and into the hallway. We walked down towards the door, but they had me wait closer to the end of the hall. I was terrified when I watched them knock on the door and demand the man to come out. He refused and said that he would hurt the boy if they tried to get in. At that moment, things became very real, and I believed him. They tried to negotiate with the man for almost an hour, but he was relentless and determined to stay in that room as long as possible. Finally, they decided to just rush the room. It almost felt like everything was in slow motion. There was a lot of yelling paired with the sounds of things crashing around the room, and before I knew it, they were walking out with a man in handcuffs. Behind them came another officer running out with the boy in his arms. He could barely hold his head up. He was put in an ambulance and rushed to the hospital. He later made a full recovery and was reunited with his mother later that morning. That floor of the hotel had been closed off while they investigated, and I learned later on that the man who was with the boy really was his father. Apparently, his wife was leaving him and taking their son because of his abusive tendencies, so he took the boy and threatened to hurt him if she left him. They had been on the run for over a month. It also unfortunately turned out that the man wasn't opposed to abusing his son, and the bruises were caused by him smacking and beating the little boy for what he called acting up. I cried for days for that kid. I wanted so badly to take away his pain and make him forget what his own father had put him through. But I know that is trauma that he'll have to live with forever. I'm just glad that he got help, and that his mom doesn't have to spend any more nights without her son.